How are you, Mr. Smithers?
Good. Welcome. Welcome to what?
We are doing a bit of a revision for our students for their next SAC coming up on economic activity, AD, business cycle.
Echo growth and low inflation.
Sounds perfect. We're kicking it off with living standards. What have we got here? Is that your car?
No, that's your car.
I wish. That's my horse.
That could have been my last holiday if I'd splashed out on a little more activities for the kids.
No, that looks like lovely South Gippsland down there. Bit of Waratah Bay action. Beautiful part of the world.
Right.
So, what am I trying? What are we talking about here? Obviously, living standards students, you need to understand the difference between material and non-material living standards, and how they link to our key goals of economic growth, obviously, and some of the limitations about economic growth we will talk about in that area. But you will often see questions in past exams talking about living standards, and it's important that you understand that in economics, whilst we do get excited about goods and services, we have sort of seen the future, and we understand that non-material living standards are vitally important too. And by non-material living standards, Mr. Smithers, what are we talking about?
We're talking about, for me, it's all about health, because the health allows you to have the quality of life that you want. And as you get older, you're starting to learn about things like health, but it's also about the way we feel, our mental health, amount of time we spend with our family, these things that can't be measured by GDP that become, I think, more and more important as you get older.
Absolutely, and it's things around leisure time, access to clean air, access to clean open spaces. The environment is certainly becoming a key factor in non-material living standards.
Indeed.
All right, let's punch on. So we will be seeing a number of cartoons throughout this presentation, students. You do need to understand they are courtesy of Peter Nicholson, and I've just put a little, he's happy for us to use them. This is a great one to get started. The God of economics has spoken. And I was talking about this in class the other day. I mean, there's some really interesting things happening in the economy at the moment, Mr. Smithers.
Yeah, well, who would have thought inflation was good? I mean, the graph I showed my class, historically in Australia, we've had some horrendous inflation in the 70s and 80s. But deflation has become a problem around the world in the past 5 years or so. And this was never a problem when we started teaching economics. It was always how to control inflation, how to keep the genie in the bottle. But this top one here is about trying to pump up inflation.
And that gets to, I saw an interesting report from a Rabobank economist saying how in Europe, what they should do is have a massive fiscal stimulus, cut income taxes and increase the VAT or the GST in order to create some inflationary expectations in the economy, so wages growth will start to grow and inflation will start to come back in. So, yeah, it's a bizarre world we're in at the moment. Inflation we're after actually a bit of price pressures in the economy, and we're also seeing this oil situation where oil is no longer, are we talking about peak oil productions, we're talking about an oil glut.
Yeah, massive increase in supply, and I know both classes saw the video about this, increase in supply, which has driven the price down by, as much as 30-40%. And this is, in some ways, it's doing the Reserve Bank's job for them in terms of helping out households and businesses with their cost pressures. So to think that oil has come down in price so quickly, and it can go up as quickly when they start controlling the supply, but it's been a big player within the economy in the last 18 months.
And the key factors leading to it, obviously, you've got increased oil production out of America through the oil fracking and oil shale production. You've seen Iran start to join through the geopolitical changes over there, and they're now joining the market. Saudi Arabia won't cut oil production at the moment. So we've actually, at the same time, we've seen, not significant, but a move away from oil as a key source of energy, with increased renewables, and China indicating that they're actually looking at cutting their global emissions, and that is having an impact upon demand for oil to some extent as well. So we're seeing it both sides. It's
a really neat little micro story, the oil market. And what about, why do we want the dollar to fall?
Well, there you go. We talked about it in this class today. I mean, you don't if you're going on your holiday back over to Europe shortly, Mr. Smithers. You don't want your dollar to fall.
No.
But we do as an economy, absolutely, because it'll make our exports more competitive, it'll make our imports less competitive, or imports come in Australia less competitive. Hopefully it'll... And we're starting actually to see it happen with those tradable sector, and particularly services, tourism, education, and even our commodities to some extent, mainly agricultural goods, beef, prices are at pretty record highs. We're seeing agricultural prices doing quite well. So the dollar falling will promote growth in Australia, particularly though in those industries that are import competing industries and export industries.
Yeah, so net exports, when we get to that, we'll be talking about the fall in the dollar being good for that.
Really important you understand that relationship.
And of course, that's our mate Glenn Stevens, who is the Governor of the Reserve Bank, who makes those big decisions. All right, and we won't worry about the last one.
Where is Australia currently on the business cycle? This is a great question, I think, because it's not about getting it right necessarily, it's about being able to justify your decision. And this is where students, you need to be able to refer to current economic conditions and your leading, your lagging, your coincident indicators. And we'll refer to these as we go through this presentation. But it's a really good question to be able to justify where you think we are on the business cycle.
And so the first place I'm going to go is to macro policy. So if I'm saying we've got 2% interest rate or cash rate set by the Reserve Bank, and we've got continuing budget deficits, then one must surmise from that information that we are south of the trend line, that we are below the line. So we're somewhere in the contractionary recession, well, not a recession certainly, but in this area. Whereabouts we are is debatable.
But having said that, GDP growth last quarter came in pretty strong,
3%.
We're the darling of the developed world. I mean, America and Europe would give a huge anything for growth at that level. So it's an interesting conundrum.
Some of the data, and so when you're discussing this, if you have to, you need to be able to justify what you're saying with reference to things like the economic growth rate or the unemployment rate. With reference to things like the household savings ratio or consumer and business confidence. So all of these we will come to, but I think this question, and I know in my class I had two students who put us here, and I wasn't going to disagree with them. Their justification for doing that was pretty sound.
Yeah,
but it's all about your discussion around your decision on where we are in the business cycle.
So one of the key things, in economics, obviously, students, you need to be able to talk about the current sort of examples, but obviously the theory is as important, or if not more important in some ways. So clearly you need to know the components of aggregate demand, how big they are, whether they're stable, whether they're not stable, what they're doing currently, and then be able to link the demand and supply factors towards them, particularly demand factors with AD.
So we've got the first part of our AD equation, of course, which is C plus I plus G 1 and 2 plus X minus M, or net exports. Now, by far the biggest component is consumption expenditure. So about 60% of our...
That's your renovation in there. Is that in there? That's 60%?
It will be, yes. If it gets above the ground. The consumption expenditure at the moment is... it has picked up in the last 6 months. So we're seeing a couple of little indicators, and when we talk about aggregate demand factors, and I could bang on about the household savings ratio, which has just declined a little, and we're seeing some more willingness of consumers to spend. But of course, there's a couple of things holding it back. Consumer confidence is still a little flat, and we've still got wage growth at very, very low levels historically.
That's a real concern, I think, wages growth. And the fact that wage growth is so slow has kept our unemployment rate down, which is a positive, but it's also meant that someone's employee is someone else's customer, and if you're not getting, we haven't got an increase in wages, then we're not seeing confidence, we're not seeing expenditure, and people start to become liquidity concerned, I guess, about their ability to spend, and that's perhaps being a drag on consumption. And why do we need, the question I think we need to ask is, why are we so concerned about consumption expenditure not growing? One, you've written it there, it's 60% of AD. But two, because previous growth was strongly driven by private investment expenditure, and that has been decimated. So I, as a component of AD, is a very volatile component, varies between 15, I think 22% the textbook says, very volatile, but it's dropped. The last figures I saw were some of the largest falls in investment expenditure we've seen. in recent history. And why is that, Mr. Smithers? Why has I fallen so much?
Well, we can just point to the mining investment boom being over and very little investment to pick up the slack since that fall or dramatic end to the mining investment boom. So
that's that rebalancing, isn't it? That's what they're talking about.
And that's what we're looking for. And thankfully, a lot of the rebalancing has taken place, has helped employment, but it hasn't seen a lot of big private investment expenditure. And so we're seeing very low levels of I in the economy at the moment. And this has been the way for the last, I'd say, about 2 years.
Yeah, absolutely.
So one thing that did pick up the slack, though, was some government expenditure in the last
G2,
figures.
particularly G2.
Yep.
And we're seeing some state governments, finally, New South Wales in particular, start to spend on some government infrastructure. We've also seen the Victorian government start to develop some infrastructure as well, which is good to see. And we do have a large budget deficit, and there are some federal government infrastructure projects out there that are occurring at the moment. So it was good to see a bounce back. And of course, infrastructure is important to the economy, not just because it adds to demand.
Because it adds to aggregate supply.
Absolutely. And it increases our capacity to supply goods and services. And also, if it's good infrastructure, it should improve the efficiency of resource use too. And that's an important element we need to...
Yeah, so when you think of infrastructure, you think of those big ticket items like the Port of Melbourne, the changes to the infrastructure there, whether it's channel deepening or whether it's access for rail to the port. You're thinking about all those things that not only create jobs and demand side, but they're really important for the supply side and the efficiency and competitiveness of our economy.
Saw an interesting thing on the news last night about how the Northern Territory government's arguing for 200 million, might have been 100 million in road funding because they're struggling to get their cattle to market. So that's another good example. Roads, a key infrastructure in Australia. Let's punch on a little bit here to external demand. Surprising stats here, external demand. Exports haven't fallen by as much as we thought in terms of value. Do we want to know why? I mean, prices have fallen, absolutely, and they've been decimated. But interestingly enough, because of production in exports has been so strong, we actually haven't seen them fall by as much as we thought.
Yeah, and this has got something to do with the inelastic supply nature of the mining companies, particularly those that invested heavily in iron ore and coal during the mining boom. Okay. And they need to recoup their costs no matter what the price, so they're all still pumping out a hell of a lot of iron ore and coal. And in fact, the volumes are up, but of course we're not getting as good a price as we were, so... but that combination of a lower price with high volume still gives us quite a good export performance, even if it doesn't reflect on the profitability of those firms. So it's not as good for the government revenues in terms of their company tax receipts, but it's certainly holding up in terms of net exports. Yeah,
and that's and we're certainly seeing that out of Western Australia to some extent. Volume's still there, Queensland as well. And one of the things that I think some mining companies are experiencing, yes, they might be operating at or below near cost or even below cost, but it's actually more expensive to shut the mine down in some cases and continue producing it.
Yep.
So they keep pumping out those exports. Imports, relatively flat.
And yeah, relatively stable. They may come down a bit depending on where the dollar goes. Although it's just had in the last 2 weeks, it's had a real bounce. But it's still sitting relatively low compared to where we were at parity a few years ago.
And the Chinese economy here, net external demand, a key demand factor for the Chinese economy. What do you think it's going to go? They just announced they argued that instead of announcing a target specifically, they've now gone for a range for their GDP, which is quite interesting.
Yeah, and they've gone through a shift from construction to a more service-based economy. So a lot of their growth is not using the commodity exports that Australia has banked on throughout most of the 2000s or the noughties that we did so well out of. A lot of the growth in China has transitioned away from that construction, which requires our commodities, into more service-based. And we're not seeing necessarily the flowing on benefits. One thing I think that we've pointed out to our classes, possibly ad nauseum in my case, is the impact of the lower dollar. So while it's bounced, it's relatively lower than it has been over the last 3 or 4 years, and has been coming down for 18 months. Now, this does help our exports, particularly our service exports of education and tourism. And it also helps in terms of keeping tourists in Australia.
Yes.
And
not
this,
you though, I hear.
No,
you.
not me.
Where are we off to?
We're off to Europe.
Oh, must be tough.
More of that later.
Must be tough in your world, Mr. Smithers.
I don't drive the car that was on the front page.
Neither do I.
So the beautiful thing about that is while those exports are expanding a little, they're very labour intensive. So it's helping the unemployment rate hold up.
And that nuance is really important to students. Good students will pick up on a nuance like that. You know, students that are really pushing themselves will pick up on those sort of elements of the economy that will set you apart from other students. You know, and that's some things that we certainly encouraging you all to do, to pay attention to the nuances that are occurring in certain things like that.
All right.
Supply side.
Yeah, let's have a look at the pretty graph.
Oh, look at that. Just leave it there for a sec. So, first question to ask students, and to be able to answer, I should say, is why is the aggregate supply curve this slope here, and then why does it turn to this slope here? So, obviously, we need to talk about a little bit about the curve at this point, Mr. Smithers.
Yeah, and it relates to, I like to draw alongside it the productive capacity graph, so our production possibility curve. So clearly at this point where the first circle is down at this point here, we are well below the curve on the corresponding graph. Whereas what has happened when the curve goes vertical is that we have basically hit productive capacity. We are utilising all our available resources to their fullest capacity. And then what we need to do then is grow aggregate supply by some way. By which way we look at the headings on the right, we need to either increase the volume, quality of resources, or we need to increase our efficiency or reduce our cost of production somehow.
And your key cost of production for most businesses, you're talking real unit labour costs, which have been low in recent years, cost of inputs, so raw materials, those sort of things, heavily affected by the Aussie dollar, which is going the other way. And then your efficiency, we're really talking about productivity, mainly of labour resources, which actually has been a little bit sluggish lately, mainly because our output working hours have not come down. And then availability of resources, our ability to find stuff and to use it. And that's labour was a key resource we struggled with a while ago, not so much now. And then you've got your other key natural land and enterprise and capital resources.
So without our scribbles, you can see there that with that first line here, we have an economy operating at well below capacity. There is spare capacity, and you would suspect at that point there is unemployment higher than Nauru. There is obviously underutilisation of resources. At this next graph here, we have a point which is at
or near full employment, I would call it. That's what I like to say is at or near full employment.
Yeah, and I would call that the sweet spot where the economy really wants to be. And what we need then is both AD and AS to grow in concert together.
Yep, spot on.
All right.
Let's punch it on a bit.
Oh, you've still got more graph. Yeah, there you go.
It's quite a complicated little slide. I'll just step it out for you, Mr. Smith. Demand and supply factors. I'm going to run through these pretty quickly, students, because we've been through these a lot. Clearly, interest rates are a key demand factor and can be a supply factor as cost of production, but don't get hung up on that. We'll probably talk more about that a little bit later when we do monetary policy, but does affect people's capacity to borrow and also does affect their liquidity if they're an existing mortgage holder in a household. But clearly they're set very loose or very low at the moment and should be acting to stimulate growth. Consumer confidence has come back a little bit, the Turnbull effect they talked about with our new Prime Minister, but then it's dropped away more recently as we've come to accept that he's actually just a politician like everyone else. Disposable income, again, fairly flat, mainly because wages growth has been slow. There is some talk about some tax cuts in the upcoming budget. I'll be surprised to see if there are any significant tax cuts in that, but certainly it's as a demand factor, it's an important one because clearly the more income you get, the more spending you can do. Yeah. And there are only really three things you can do with a dollar, as we've talked about. You can spend it, you can save it, or you can give it to ScoMo through taxes, which you don't really want to have to do.
That's Scott Morrison from my class.
The Treasurer.
We haven't got up to that. So you can also use wage growth as a demand factor instead of disposable income if you think that tells more of a story for you.
True.
next one is real unit labour costs, which we touched on before. This is a supply factor. So the first three we suggest you use as demand factor. Well, they're all demand factors. Interest rates can be used as a supply factor, but we've hinted strongly that you should use it as a demand. RULC's real unit labour costs is a supply factor. This hasn't been improving for businesses that well. What it does is it compares the cost of labour with the productivity that they produce or their output. So what we want to see is real unit labour costs declining, and that will see an increase in aggregate supply and in our productive capacity. Business confidence is, of course, a demand factor. One of the big things that students can get wrong is, and written in a lot of assessment reports, is the confusion about business confidence because they think it's business, it's supply. It is a demand factor because it impacts business investment. And business confidence has been pretty low over the past couple of years.
And it makes sense when you think about it, students. You know, if you're confident about your future profits as a business, then you'll borrow and you'll spend and you'll build a new factory, you'll build a new extension of your business, you'll take on new offices, those sort of things, and that will lead to increased investment. Whereas if you're not sure about the future, you're a little bit concerned that there might be another financial crisis, or China might go into recession, or the government's an election year, perhaps they mightn't get re-elected, and that does create some confidence issues for businesses. You'll delay spending or investment, and that means that you won't be spending money on expanding your business. So it's a clear demand factor. It's an important one for investment expenditure, and it's one that you should be able to discuss.
Okay. Now, it's also important to note this is not an exhaustive list or the ones that we deem as being the ones we must use. You can use any of them. My class will know I love the household savings ratio as a demand factor. And there are certainly some other supply factors, and we've discussed exchange rates particularly as a supply factor, and what is happening to the cost of production, and that's putting upward pressure on cost inflation at the moment, although it's just not winning out.
No. All right, let's punch on.
Let's get on to eco growth.
Got a meeting to get to. Goals, economic growth. Clearly a bit of a checklist here. Students, you need to be able to define what we mean by economic growth. You need to talk about the measurement of economic growth, obviously GDP, but clearly we did spend some time talking about MAP and the GPI. We haven't got it here, but you do need to know them. You need to know what's wrong with economic growth. Household activity measures non-market activity. It measures
lots of limitations.
Lots of limitations of GDP as a measure of economic growth. And then back to our first slide. What are the limitations of GDP as a measure of living standards? And that's where the alternatives come in. Demand and supply, we've discussed here the key demand factors. Performance, well, it's pretty good.
Yeah, the latest data was positive, and especially when you do compare it against the OECD average and those other advanced economies, and we've had a little bit of a rebound. But what we can say about this period here is that it has been below trend. So we've got a period of growth that the government has, since the GFC, they've been trying to push back to their target of 3 to 4%. And I think most economists have said that we're just going to have to get used to growth at 2.5 to 3 at best, just for the near term or the medium term. And so I don't think our economy is performing badly, but there's still clearly spare capacity within the economy, and growth could pick up.
And the key, I don't have time to talk about it now, but the lack of growth in nominal GDP is a real concern for government revenues, for living standards, and that's got to do with our terms of trade falling. So that's the other side to it. Remember, GDP is a growth measure of production, it's a measure of income. So that's something I think that potentially, probably not in this SAC student, but something we will need to grapple with later on.
Definitely. All right.
Low inflation.
Now, while the graph refers to the problem of deflation around the world, not so much in Australia, of course, but there was a graph shown in my class today, and I think yours showed Japan's
deflation. Yeah, it's shocking.
And they've managed to bounce back a little, but and that reflects with the recession in Japan. Very poor economic times over the period. Well, over a long period of time. So again, with the goal of inflation, just like the goal of economic growth, you need to know the definition, the measurement, the target. So not only do we want you to know if you don't know the target of 2 to 3% over the course of the business cycle, and you can't parrot that back to us, we'd be very disappointed.
Yeah, as I said to my class students, there are just some things you need to learn. You need to learn some definitions, and economics is a subject about terminology and language. So there's some things you need to learn, and these little checklists we provided here for your key goals are really important.
And there are demand and supply factors impacting on inflation at the moment. Now, we know that inflation is well under control. In fact, it's right at the low end of the target or even slightly below it. So there aren't too many pressures putting... There are a few, but not too many putting upward pressure on inflation. And at the moment, we've probably got we could do with a little more aggregate demand. As we've said, there is some cost pressures with regards to the dollar.
But probably outweighed by the cost pressures or cost deflation caused by falling oil prices.
That's right.
You know, and energy costs are lower to some extent. You're seeing wages costs are down. So yeah, there's clearly more downward pressure on prices than there are upward pressure, I would say. Anyway.
Yeah. So the article that we shared with you, which quoted a couple of economists, was talking about the performance of the inflation, the latest inflation data, which was the December data. It basically said that inflation was at a point where it was completely under control, and neither the government nor the Reserve Bank needed to worry too much about it in the medium term.
But that doesn't mean you shouldn't worry about it.
No, you have to worry about it.
You have to know it.
And certainly, as I told my class today, it may mean that you need to know the theory of high inflation, because a favourite question in the past has been, what to do about high inflation or what's caused it.
But the other thing I think is important, you need to understand why we target inflation to be 2 to 3%. So, i.e., what's wrong with high inflation is a really important thing. Students should be able to articulate what is bad about high inflation. Even though we don't have it, there's a reason we're concerned about it. If it was to come back and creep back in, historically it has been there. And it's a tough question, but it's one you should be able to answer.
And that, of course, goes to the competitiveness of our nation. And if we had the long-term graph, there's our band of target. And I would suggest that over the course of the business cycle, they've done a pretty good job, of achieving that target. And as you saw in my class today, this is the number one goal of monetary policy and the Reserve Bank. And
the question is why? Why do we target low inflation? And there's some simple answers, students, that you need to be able to sort of explain. It improves our international competitiveness. It helps people in low incomes or weak bargaining positions maintain their purchasing power. It allows for resource allocation efficiency, and by that I mean it encourages investment in productive resources. It discourages investment in things like housing, ideally. We haven't seen a lot of that in Australia, clearly, but investment in things like antiques and gold, what I call non-productive assets.
All right, I've called them speculative in my class.
Yeah, absolutely. Speculative assets is a good way of saying it. So it discourages investment in those things, and it encourages investment in productive assets that are employment generating, income building, economy growing. So inflation is inflationary expectations, when they build into an economy, can create wages pressures and wages growth, and you can end up in a wage price spiral. So it's important to be able to articulate why low inflation is such an important objective.
All right, you better go to your meeting, Mr. Burns. Thanks for your time.
My pleasure. Good luck, everyone, and we'll see you next time.
We'll see you Thursday for the